On behalf of the CIM ESRS Tailings Working Group, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes with 30 minutes for Q&A. The session will be recorded, and so you'll get a post-webinar, you'll get an email with a recording access to it. You're in listen-only mode, but Q&A is enabled, so please drop some questions that come to mind as you go through this in the chat. The chat is also enabled, so if you want to drop a note in the chat, say hello to everyone, go ahead. Now, I'm Daniel Schneider, and I'm presenting with Andrew Thrift today. Risk-informed decision-making was identified as a theme for ESRS this year, and Andrew and I have been working with ESRS as the working group to shape and define a series of webinars. So thanks again for attending. Before we get started, I want to identify a few past webinars that were done recently. Luis Grandin and Andrew Taylor described their journey on multi-objective decision-making and some of the courageous leadership decisions. So the recording will be made available in the chat. That was done in October. Then Andrew and I had the pleasure of interviewing a series of tailings and water SMEs, and to really understand the challenges faced, and then to look for the origins of decision science and risk management to see the types of solutions. And so we had a panel discussion with Chad Lapoudre, from a global expert on tailings and water, Bill Haskett, another decision science expert, and Diane Del-Belarus. We had a great interview and discussion. So check out that recording, look for additional insights to build on some of the content and messages we'll discuss today. Now, in February coming up, Charles Dumaresque will offer an overview of the updated Towards Sustainable Mining Tailings Guide. So please join for that and get an update from Charles. Finally, in April, Chad will deliver an overview of what resilience-based tailings management looks like. Now, Chad is a global expert, and he's going to offer his insights and his decades-wide experience, and it should be a great webinar. Now, Andrew and I have partnered with Jim Spanier, who brings a finance lens to decision analysis, for a short course at the CIM Connect conference on the Saturday leading up to it. It's called Investment Evaluation and Decision Analysis Best Practices. Now, Jim spent 20 years in investment evaluation and decision analysis at BHP. And a big part of BHP's success was the leveraging the diversity of decision science along with finance and making better investment choices. Topics that we'll look to discuss in that will include decision framing, generating strategic alternatives, leveraging risk and uncertainty analysis, and then looking at the life of asset, high quality cash flows, so you really understand the project as it works through its full life cycle. Ultimately, by delivering and selecting the right projects in the right way, you can maximize value. Finally, before I get started, I want to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples across the world have a rich history of participatory decision-making. For thousands of years, they've used the tools and techniques that we'll describe in part in some of the best practice that we'll describe today. So I really encourage you all to learn more about decision-making practice for Indigenous peoples in the places where you come. With that, I'll pass it over to Andrew to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Dan. So over the next hour or so, we want to show you how to use decision science to help you deliver more value from your projects. So not just saving time, money, and effort, but also increasing your upside. We'll share case studies along the way and allow lots of time for questions. We think that the stories of how it's showing value are more interesting. One of those key aspects is mindset and skill set are more important than tool set. We like to go to tools quickly, but even the best tools can put you into analysis paralysis or give you false confidence if you're not thinking about decisions in the right way. Start small and iterate. You can make great decisions much faster than you have in the past when you start simple and know what shortcuts to look for and which ones are safe, which ones are dangerous. Frame first. The most value comes from framing the decision appropriately. Experienced decision professionals have repeatedly told us to F off. That is, focus on framing and facilitation. So that might be the only thing you remember today is F off, but if you do, you're one step ahead. Next slide, Dan. I want to share the story how we arrived at our current state of using multiple counts analysis and other decision tools to give you a sense of the untapped opportunity in our industry. Now, around 1998, Andy Robertson, who was a brilliant geotechnical engineer, an innovator, who I'm sure many of you know, he ran into a decision problem as part of a mine permitting process that he couldn't really be addressed with the tools he had in hand. So he asked his colleague Shannon Shaw to find a suitable structured decision-making tool. They adapted a tool from PC Hydro to use on tailings alternative assessments. And because Andy was an industry leader, had a lot of credibility, other people started using it. Environment Canada found it really valuable, so they ultimately incorporated it into their guidelines for the assessment of alternatives for mine waste disposal in 2016. So Andy and Shannon reached into the decision science toolbox, picked up a tool that solved the problem they were facing, and the rest is history. They also profoundly shaped my career. A conversation with Andy and Shannon about MEA was a catalyst for my master's degree research centered on decision analysis being used for involving stakeholders in mine waste decisions, which resulted in evaluating some work that an MEA that Andy and Shannon were doing at the Acadie Diamond Mine up in the NWT. So what I've discovered in the 20 years since is that there are a lot of other useful tools in the toolbox. And although MEA has been highly valuable, there's many more. So today we're going to share stories about some of the most valuable tools we've encountered. And to use a metaphor, great carpenter can make really useful things with a hammer. You give them a lathe, a planer, etc. They can build a lot more. So you want to add more tools into your toolbox. At least be aware of them. Next slide, Dan. So let's jump to a case study about siting a facility. Pretty common project decision. So the company needed to select a site for a water treatment plant. And the old way of choosing a site was a project engineer finds a few alternatives, estimate their cost, choose the lowest cost option, away you go. So here the project team identified 6 alternatives located close to the creek where the treated effluent will be discharged based on discussions with the mine operations team. They conducted an MAA and they consulted individual SMEs one by one, including environmental and permitting experts, to score the decision criteria in each of their respective areas of expertise. So MAA, it's a good tool, much superior to the old way of doing things. So kudos to the project team. The challenge here was that the MAA results all showed that all the alternatives they had come up with had a common drawback. That proximity to the creek resulted in higher risk of flooding impacts on recreational users, which would affect permitting. And so they realized, oh, short piping distance is good for cost, it's bad for these other things. So they went back to the operations team, had them identify a few more alternatives, and came up with 3 more, redid the MAA. 2 of those 3 new alternatives were better than the original 6. So they've selected alternative and mission accomplished. So how could the team have prevented that multi-week delay, almost a month? A framing session with representation from the various SMEs before jumping to analysis would have refined the decision criteria and elicited a more diverse set of alternatives. And the project team skipped framing because it was really hard to schedule, a bunch of people, which is a pretty common issue, like that's real. The trade-off is that they didn't have that interdisciplinary discussion that probably would have identified some of these issues with the first set of alternatives quickly. So one of those things is in a framing session, you validate decision criteria, and that would have probably elicited that logic conversation around, well, piping distance is great for you for costs and maintenance probably as well, but the trade-off is that flooding risk and the permitting challenges, which far outweigh that minor incremental cost savings. So if you can identify those logic issues at the criteria definition stage, you can go a lot faster. And even a simple decision sketch we'll talk about later would have probably revealed this. And getting scores from individual SMEs, like in one-on-one interviews, that's actually a really good practice. It makes great use of group time, which is pretty scarce, hard to book. The challenge is you do need that group discussion often to help each other identify blind spots. And project teams we talk to often assumed when you say we need a framing workshop, it's like a one-day in-person workshop, tons of resources. We've actually been quite successful in doing these virtually when needed, doing them in kind of 1 to 2 hour sprints using a virtual whiteboard like Miro and Mural. So they don't necessarily need to be in person, although in person is always ideal. You can get most of the value from a virtual workshop. Next slide. So our starting point is multiple accounts analysis. So I'll give a bit of a primer here, talk about its advantages and limitations, but I'll move through it pretty quickly because I assume that most of you have at least some exposure to multiple accounts analysis or other multi-criteria decision analysis tools like Kepner-Trago, which is quite similar. For a deeper dive on these tools, I'd recommend a webinar that Darryl Hockley, Andy Small, and Cassandra Hall gave a couple of years ago, lessons learned from tailings decision analysis. It has a more in-depth treatment of MCDA tools and how to choose them, which is really quite good. And all of them are really good practitioners in this space. So MAA, it breaks a decision into small pieces, helps us put them back together in a logical way. That systematic analysis of the merits of each it results in a scoring process by SMEs, a preference weighting process by the owner and decision maker. You put them all together, do a weighted average, and you get a summary score. So it's pretty fast, it's transparent. You can see the scores. The math isn't hard. You don't need specialized software. You can do pretty simple sensitivity analysis, adjusting the weightings to see, okay, if I didn't care about project cost, if I really cared about socioeconomic issues, would it change the ranking of my alternatives? So those things are advantages relative to other MCDA methods. And certainly MA is much, much better than not doing any type of MCDA for a decision with some complexity in it. Limitations, it doesn't help you get creative alternatives. You need something else. So you need framing up front or upstream of MAA. We'll talk about that more later. You can't model the effects of uncertainty well. So particularly for cost, economic value, there's much more robust ways of treating uncertainty in that you can get bogged down by too many objectives and alternatives. I see this all the time where a team carries too many alternatives that are not really that different, or way too many alternatives. The team gets really bogged down and discouraged. You end up scoring a bunch of things that aren't really material. Another disadvantage in practice is that you debate, you throw a number up there, but there's very rarely any notes taken about that scoring. So talking to people who've gone back later, sometimes years later, and understanding like, why did we score this one higher than this one, is often opaque because the discussion in the room rarely gets captured as part of the documentation. So we'll go to the next slide. So there's great tools out there. MA is just one of them.
Great. I'm going to jump back in, and I want to talk about the problem we're solving. First, that in traditional project management, the typical process is identify the problem or opportunity, jump to generating a solution, evaluate the business case, seek approval, and then implement that choice. Now, the challenge with that is that you fall into a series of common decision traps. The first one is charging ahead. And we all feel this pressure to get started. But when you do this, you fail to really understand the decision context and tailor a decision process to that specific context. Then when you look to generating a solution, often the trap is you default to the status quo. And with that, you go for a mediocre option because everyone feels comfortable. It's what we did last time, or it's what we know, instead of looking for different, more creative solutions that offer more. Now, evaluating the business case often assumes unexamined, you'll find unexamined assumptions, some flawed thinking of review of options, particularly around risk and uncertainty. Now, we're, as scientists and engineers, we love analyzing, and sometimes we get stuck in over-analyzing or over looking at the analysis side of this. And further, it doesn't really consider, you may not consider multiple perspectives. Now, the next decision trap is black box choices. This is where someone just wants to do something. So they create something, they don't tell you why, and there can be misaligned values and criteria into making those choices. The final one is that you get a fixed mindset. You don't do backcasting and look back at the past decisions for lessons on how you can improve. And organizationally, this is hard. You have to accept some of the accountability for failures or improvements and really look closely. And this is adapted from Diana Del Bellarusa. I think it illustrates the problem we're working to solve. I'm going to pass it back over to Andrew, who'll talk more about decision science.
Great. So what is decision science? If you're not very familiar with decision science, you're not alone. Despite decision making being part of what every human being in the world does, it's not the standard part of our education from K to 12, even undergrad. I was only interested in grad school and of course in the planning school, actually at UBC. You might encounter some of it in an MBA, but it's really not something that's widely taught. We mostly learn decision making by trial and error, which is one way to learn, but not the most efficient way. In plain language, it's the art and science of unwinding complex problems and opportunities to gain clarity and make decisions on a more informed basis. So its origins are in mathematics, dating back hundreds of years, probability theory, a lot of work by gamblers trying to beat the odds that inform risk management, a lot of common links there. And it's based on principles for making rational decisions to maximize our benefit or utility. So that's kind of the rational side of it, kind of the prescriptive side. Like this is how you should make rational decisions to get more of what you want. It's also shaped by behavioral science. So in the last 30, 40 years, we've discovered we do not make decisions rationally most of the time. We have all these habits and heuristics and shortcuts, which are advantageous evolutionarily. They really helped us evolve to be efficient with our cognitive capacity, but they trip us up in a complex information environment. So Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, you may have heard of that book, Behavioral Economics. That's some of the other wording. So all that research in psychology has shown us, there's a lot of decision traps, and so we build process to identify those. Just to give you a really concrete example of a cognitive bias, of which there are many, and one is called availability bias. So if something's more available in your memory, you kind of overweight that. So if you were a hunter-gatherer on the savannah and you see a lion one day in one spot, it's a pretty good bet you're going to see a lion in the same spot the next day. So you're going to be aware of that risk. But if you're deciding whether you fly or drive someplace, you're reading the newspaper, you read about a horrific plane crash, you're going to, oh, maybe I should drive. Flying feels risky. The empirical data suggests driving is much more dangerous, but because you've got that in your memory and it's vivid, and you have the illusion of control in a vehicle when you're driving, you might overweight the risk of flying. So that's one example. We often jump straight into tools. You talk about mindset, skill set, tool set. We're problem solvers. We want to move quickly. Just give me a tool, let me use it. But the mindset is really, really essential. Are we clear on our values? Do we hide from uncertainty, or do we work with it? And a critical mindset element that's really fundamental is that we judge the quality of decision at the time it's made, not afterwards when we know the outcomes. So we use these 6 elements of a good decision. I'm not going to walk through them today. We've got questions, bring it up in the Q&A. The reason we do this is because that's when it's useful. So if I'm heading up towards a decision, I can look, and I've done this for major decisions. I've got a kind of a checklist. I say, okay, did we frame it well? Have we got good data? Have I engaged the implementers and stakeholders so they actually follow through and implement this decision? I can do these things. Am I ready for a decision? Yes. Or you know what? I'm missing data, or I need to do some more engagement. So it's that checklist when it's useful before I make the decision. What we typically do is we think about outcomes, and we say, well, that ended up working out. I must have made a good decision. You see this often in business magazines where someone's a CEO of the year one year because their stock price is high, and then it's Nortel Networks next year they're out of business and the person is slunk away. To give a really vivid example of that, 2 people are at the bar one person's having a drink or multiple drinks, too many drinks. They decide, I'm going to wing it and drive home. Somehow they make it home safely, don't hurt anyone. Another person, they're there at the designated driver, they don't drink, they drive some people home, but as they drop people off, they head home and they get T-boned by someone who's running a red light. So, the outcome, one person got off scot-free, a person had a major accident, but it's pretty clear who made the good decision. Luck was the other factor. So decision plus luck equals outcome. And if we evaluate decision quality after the outcome is known, it's really hard to tease out the luck part and the narrative fallacy if we keep telling ourselves we're good decision makers because we might get lucky. One of the things that we talk about with decision science is that it's common sense. The skill set is quite important, and we use our creativity to develop alternatives. Should we do that rather than defaulting to the first idea that comes up? Of course, but this is sometimes termed common sense, not commonly applied. So anyone can greatly benefit from applying decision science tools. It takes a fair bit of practice to master them and turn them into habits. And so Dan and I have honed our skills in recent years, primarily through involvement with the Society of Decision Professionals, which is a global organization for people who do this. For some, it's a full-time job in their company. You know, big companies like Chevron have 200 decision analysts across the globe who do this function. Others are more solo, but that's kind of a place where people who practice this compare notes. So if you're really interested in this, consider checking it out. We'll get more into toolset later in the conversation. Back to you, Dan.
Great. I want to first outline a decision science approach. First, we define the problem or opportunity we're solving. And we spend more time on that to make sure we're really clear on what we're after. And there's a bit of an art and science to being clear about it. Often for these large, complex projects, it's an interrelated set of different problems, and it's not necessarily clear what it is. Once we know the problem, then we look at trying to clarify the objectives, reflecting on what matters most and getting clear on the diverse array of objectives, not just for that project, but for that site asset, for the larger picture of objectives, so that we can identify multiple objectives that are important for any given project. Then we work to use creative thinking. And there's this tendency to rush ahead and evaluate options. But when you generate options, you don't mix evaluation of those options. You generate a diverse menu of options in consideration of what you want. And you really fight through processes to identify those good, diverse sets of options. Then we have separate structured processes to evaluate those. That's when we look for uncertainty management, risk management, and change management to really get real with what's possible and using that critical thinking. With that process done, then you can work to develop a plan that makes sense and then ideally execute to that plan. Now, decision science has different tools for each aspect of this. And that's a key difference. We work to identify the problem and we have different tools for that. You want to work for objectives, you have different processes and frameworks to identify what those objectives, and then again, looking at those options. Now, we also have really strong mathematical tools that are helpful to embrace that uncertainty that really exists, characterize it in a probabilistic range-based way. Does it matter in the decision context? Is that information useful? Is that going to change our decision? It's a bit of an art form. And Andrew and I's experience is that if you start small and iterate, again, starting with simple tools on just sketching it out, understanding it, talking to a few SMEs, we work to minimize the amount of effort required to move ahead and proceed with a good decision. And as a decision, we try to be more like artists, finding the right tool at the right time, at the right place, and it just becomes a fun habit of working through some of the thought leadership that you get to engage with people. So let's jump into a case study.
All right, so we're next number of slides. Sorry, Dan, you're going to speak to this one. Go, let you go.
Yeah, this one's mine. Yeah, so the layout of the slides, we'll run through some case studies and we'll mix it in with some points that we try to make with each one of these. So you'll see consistency. There's the problem we're solving, the people and process, and some of the outcomes and lesson learned. And the images used are just references. They're not the actual sites. So no need to hunt around and try to identify a site that you might be familiar with. So the case study here was an ARD upgrade project. In this case, there was a waste rock disposal facility. And the goal was to relocate the ARD system, the collection system, and it needed to be cost effective, but also reliable and resistant long-term for that asset. So a conventional approach might be run ahead, mine department goes out, finds an engineering firm, seeks regulatory approval, get a permit, and go out and build it. Now, the problem with this is that you run into siloed thinking. You don't fully consider the multiple objectives that an asset is working to achieve. And by the time that input's in, it's costly to change the design, and you never fully recover the value. I'll come back to the case study. But again, if you race out and do it, a poor choice, and you run out, even with good execution, you can never recover the full value of a good choice. So I'm going to talk about what a good choice was and how we supported that in the execution so that we can capture that enhanced value. Now, this is a key theme. We want to enhance how we can create value out of our capital and resources. It's not about the money, it's about the time and effort. We're limited and constrained. So in this case, to solve this particular challenge, I had a great team. We had a diverse team of SMEs. We sat down in a room over 3 days. We had a series of 2-hour sprints, and we were able to develop a common understanding across multiple SMEs. Now, in this case, it was just an owner team, but that ultimately held. It was clear what the project was, how it related to different people, and what the key decisions were, what the options were. And by the key outcomes we had from this is that we really integrated those site-wide perspectives at the initiation stage, building that clarity and alignment and functions. And there was all this understanding of what was actually going on, what the project was about, how it linked to their role, their department, and how it was important to them. So by getting their ideas and understanding how it was and understanding the multiple objectives that were important, we're able to build that clarity across those functions and then ultimately develop a series of options and important actions that were that could be evaluated. In this case, I took a shortcut. We didn't need to lean into the objectives because the roadmap was fairly clear. We also had the decision maker right there in the room. And so we were able to have dialogue and discussions on pinch points and how it worked within these different departments and teams. And that dialogue created a much more aligned centric approach. And ultimately, we came out of it with a really clear roadmap of how to move forward with implementation, who was going to take the lead across it. Now, in this case, this is a $10 to $15 million capital investment. I would sure hope that people can afford to spend 6 hours to sit down so they can speed up and accelerate their project execution. Because ultimately, this is how we create more value. And client comments coming out of this, we should do more of that. This sort of thing makes decisions so much clearer. This would sure help with scope creep. So we had a great success. It was great fun. And Andrew will share some other case studies. Over to you, Andrew.
Right. So this is a case study of addressing impacts to water balance with potential impacts to production that could be significant. So you got a concern about increasing selenium concentrations in mine impacted water, which there's a risk of ultimately limiting their ability to discharge because of permit conditions. The operational storage capacity in the tailing facility was already used up, so didn't want to add any more, wanted to keep all the freeboard. So if they were accumulating more water, they would have had to temporarily store it in the pit, limiting access to the high-grade ore. So short-term, if they couldn't get a handle on the water balance year over year, the maximum foreseeable loss was pretty bad. Your production curtailment, leading to even potentially temporary closure. So this is something that was pretty important. Traditional solution would be to hire a consultant to come up with a selenium reduction strategy because we thought it was a selenium issue. Instead, the mine convened a framing workshop with multidisciplinary participation, so site and corporate SMEs, to address the problem of increasing selenium concentrations. So at the workshop, they're debating the problem definition, standard part of that process, and then they're realizing, well, there's a risk of selenium increasing to impact our discharge, but TDS, total dissolved solids, is already doing that. Could we do more in that space? And they realized, oh, yes, we could. And then, well, what about physical water management? Enhancing our diversion strategy to keep more clean water clean. Oh, yeah, we could do that. So the group expanded their scope and problem definition and came up ultimately with a broad portfolio to address both the chemical and physical aspects of the water balance challenge. That became a water volume and quality management program that addressed a bunch of things in parallel. So without that early framing conversation, they might have gone on for a year having a consultant work on selenium reduction as a standalone and lost potentially a whole year of advancing a bunch of different programs in parallel. And so that early framing discussion was really instrumental in understanding the full scope of the problem so they could tackle it together. We'll go to the next slide, Dan. So this is a metaphor that I heard and found really helpful. So the optimization is like finding the best route at the top of the mountain. You know, should we go up the east or the west glacier, up this route or not? And we're really keen to get to the top, right? We see it, we want to rush to the top. What framing does is it says, are we on the right mountain? So getting to the top of the mountain is only helpful if you start at the base of the right mountain. And what we really want to do is avoid climbing the wrong mountain, because going fast up the wrong mountain is not helpful. And there are very few things so disheartening as you've done all this great analysis, you go to the decision maker and say, here it is, we've got a clear recommendation, we want to do this, and they say, that's not the problem I asked you to solve. You don't want to play go fetch a rock with your decision maker. So define your frame early, validate it with the decision maker at the start, say, here's what I understand you want me to solve, here's the criteria. Even the decision maker doesn't ask, I've done this where I've gone and I said, okay, I think you asked me this, and I think here's the criteria, is this it? And it's a thumbs up, or it's like, actually I meant this, saved a huge amount of effort. Back to you, Dan.
So the main point of this one is that you can take shortcuts and simple tools are useful. In this case, the challenge faced was that there was inconsistent adoption of software required for social risk management and reporting. And it was that link between site teams and corporate teams. Now, the corporate team couldn't track what was happening at each of the global operations, and it was tough to understand what was happening and what was going on. So they ultimately couldn't do their job. Now, the original idea was to jump ahead, look to find some better software, develop a training program, and add some features. Well, in this case, what I identified, just provided the decision sketch. The SME, the leader of that, wrote out the decision sketch and then developed it quite well. Put a bunch of ideas and categorized it in a systematic way, and then brought it back to me. And I went and read through the decision sketch, clarified a few points. Again, getting clear on the problem we're solving, understanding different ways that it could be solved. And then we ended up having a virtual meeting with just some Q&A and some discussions in a small group. And we identified that software wasn't really the issue. It was the need to have better partnership and understanding between site and corporate teams, and that site teams didn't fully understand the benefits and the necessary value that timely and accurate reporting would provide corporate teams and the overall enterprise. They were focused more on the community, and so by having that clarity, they were able to understand more about their corporate function and work closer with those teams. So again, it's just looking at the problem clearly in a structured way. And like it does make common sense, but I've seen many cases where software is applied or there's something, but it doesn't address the fundamental root cause of what's causing the challenge faced. Next one's with Andrew. So over to you, Andrew.
All right, so this is a situation, kind of an unusual project, but an interesting one. So companies develop a new technology for water treatment. They want to include an impact assessment saying, if we apply this mitigation, here's our water quality modeling projections, et cetera. They want to include an impact assessment, but it's novel, it's new. There's not a ton of historical data showing evidence of its effectiveness. And so how do you deal with that? And so had internal framing sessions. So they were kind of a bit stuck, and typically it would have been just, I think just more discussion in their team, but okay, let's have a framing session. Let's get everyone in the room rather than the senior leader worrying about it in their office. So internal framing workshop brought SMEs together. This was a virtual one. So we're talking through it, I'm facilitating, and they realized during the workshop, they had been dealing with kind of the frontline technical reviewers, providing scientific evidence, which was supportive of their request to include it. But they weren't actually communicating with the senior officials who are responsible for the government's risk appetite. So probably ADMs, DMs, even elected officials who have that response for defining risk appetite that then those technical reviewers are implementing. So they need to communicate the benefits of this as well. And so we got halfway through the workshop, and realized the team had entirely ignored this domain of kind of providing communication and evidence to this group. And we just stopped, halfway through the workshop. Okay, you know what to do, go do it. The key lesson learned here is that framing is valuable, but you only do what's needed to achieve clarity. And you don't run the process end to end if you just identify that you don't need a strategy table. You don't need some of these things that you produce as deliverables out of the back end of a framing workshop. If the team knows what to do, if they didn't have enough to get a mandate from the decision maker to act on that, then you stop. So one of the things we find is often people are running processes, whether it's MAA or other things, to the end when a bit of kind of outside perspective could really short circuit the process. Next slide. So now we're going to unpack decision framing a little bit more since we've talked about it a bunch. So what is it? It's a scalable group process to efficiently clarify the key elements of an opportunity or problem. The conversation that Dan had with the social performance manager about her software issue, that's framing, 2 people in a room. At the other end of the spectrum, I facilitated multi-day in-person workshops with project leads and executives, how we're going to maximize value of a flagship asset. We've also organized a virtual framing workshop for 35 people, including global experts within a few weeks lead time to address an urgent operational challenge. So it is highly scalable, and a good facilitator can manage in those different contexts. It fosters integrative discussion between disciplines for robust project planning. So as you've heard in some of these examples, getting people in the room together to look at the problem, challenge each other's perspectives, get aligned on what the key drivers are, so valuable. What they get to understand is what's really important in their peers' world, and they can be scanning and seeing, if they see signals of like, oh, in the workshop, they mentioned that this was a real key challenge for them or a constraint, and I just saw something here that might influence that. I'm going to pick up the phone. Those things happen when teams understand the bigger picture, how the system works. And then they also helps define the problem, scope boundaries, vision of success, decision criteria. So these are some of the kind of the deliverables, if you want to call it that, the process steps you often do in framing. We've talked about the value of kind of defining and validating the problem, scope boundaries kind of tied with that. Vision of success is another way of kind of testing to make sure you've got the same view of the problem. It's also a great way to energize people about how exciting it'll be to be at the other end of the process successfully. That helps spur the ideation, the creativity of the alternatives generation. And then getting the decision criteria right is also part of that. That space for creative brainstorming is probably the most valuable part of framing, maybe problem definition out there as well, is that we often, that diagram that Dan showed where you go wide, then you narrow down, we often don't go very wide. We pick one option, well, the first thing that comes to mind or the thing we did last time, and then we might say, well, we should come up with a few alternatives, and you choose some incremental things on the other side. What you really want is to create a space where people can be truly creative. It's psychologically safe. You throw the wild and crazy ideas out there, and then you quickly sort through them. It's far better to get those on the table. One of the rules of thumb for these is you want to throw on the board alternatives that are kind of one step beyond what you think are feasible to really make sure you define the widest scope of potential alternatives, and then you narrow in from there. It's much more frustrating to go advance to a project board or a steering committee, and they say, well, what about that? You haven't thought about that. Okay, you go back to the beginning, add one later. So it's better to start wide, allow people space for creativity, and then zoom in from there. And then also that process of identifying what decisions really move the needle. What are the drivers? What are things we can work for later? What are things that are boundary conditions or givens? And testing those with decision makers are all really key parts of this. And it's often that one idea. One thing we encourage people is saying that one idea you have, should I mention or not? That might be the whole thing that unlocks huge value, solves a problem that's been really hard. So you never know what's going to come out of these brainstorming sessions. Back to you, Dan.
Okay. Not only are those framing sessions fun, but again, that integrative aspect is critical to the success of it. Now, one of the things that I love about decision science, it's about, we have great tools, but it's also processes that consider both people and process. And as a decision professional, I work to identify the right tool at the right time, depending on the problem we're working to solve. Now, we have a whole suite of different processes and tools to use that can lead to that logically correct decision. Now, one of the things that multiple accounts analysis doesn't provide as an evaluation tool is the focus on having the right involvement of the right people. Now, with the right involvement of the right people, that's what builds credibility and commitment by those right people. Now, the technical details are sometimes easy. And I find in my experience, there's a quick jump to another technical study that is important or exciting or recommended by a consulting group that we want to reduce some of this uncertainty and this is going to solve our problem. But actually understanding risk appetites, risk characterization, understanding the leveraging, the diversity of people available, and through facilitated engagements and structured dialogues using these process frameworks, we can fight the bias we all bring to a decision problem. And also another element of people and process is decision governance. By early thinking around who holds decision rights, who needs to be engaged, who is clear, who is responsible for implementation of that, involving in some of those discussions can be a huge source of value. So let's jump into a case study where I show a fairly complicated site where people and process were realized. Now, in this case, the problem solved here was we needed to reduce the total volume of water in a tailings facility by 10 million cubic meters in order to realize the life of mine plan. Now, this is a wicked problem in order to deal with the water because they're discharge constrained. Now, in this case, to handle a wide, diverse problem, we need to first understand the risk characterization. Now, many of you are likely familiar with risk matrices. Now, there's dangers of risk matrices because they characterize it in a simplistic way. They're easy to understand, but in order to understand and actually characterize it, you need to link that to a decision. You have to characterize it in a way that's probabilistic. Now, to do that, we looked at the water and load balance uncertainty model, looked at the climate projections, looked at the available capacity in the tailings facility, which was again full of water and needed to fill up with tailings to realize that life of mine plan, and identified the uncertainty, the range of uncertainty given the climate model, given the uncertainty of that water and load balance. That characterized the amount of volume that needed to be reduced through a suite of projects. By taking a portfolio type lens at it, no single project could achieve the actual reduction needed. So in this case, we convened a workshop of, again, site and corporate leads. We had 30 SMEs. We ran a hybrid at two different offices, me being at the site and another party, Bill Haskett, at the corporate office. And that site-wide engagement and that diverse idea generation, it helped understand and identify a great diversity of portfolio of different ways that we can improve water. Now, I had the pleasure of working over there 4 or 5 days around the site to then further shape those ideas in a constructive way so we could define what each scope was, look for synergies, look for different, looking for clarifications. And so in the big workshop setting, you don't get a chance to have that direct dialogue. And so I went around the site, sat with the mill team, sat with operations, had a great trip into the pit to look at the actual challenges faced and some of the real things. And I love getting out on the ground and understanding what is actually happening. I like to be operationally smart and efficient and understand it. And so we had a process to rank. Originally, I think we had maybe 150 ideas that were shaped down to 140. And then ultimately, we came up with about 30 to, I think we had 40 total that we're able to estimate a range of costs for each. And I used a structured process. Expert elicitation is a wonderful tool. SMEs in these fields, whether you're a consultant or on the owner team, know way more. They know so much, and they're able to, with a structured methodology, they can estimate with a clear scope and a structured methodology, they can estimate cost ranges for this and benefit ranges, like how much benefit are we going to get if we do this project, and also relative ranking the doability of that. By doing that, it was a fast, cheap, and effective way to not only just inventory the solutions, get clear on those, but attain the data input so we could probabilistically, so we could use a stochastic model to identify the suite of solutions that would ultimately buy down that sudden closure risk. Monte Carlo is a wonderful tool, and I am surprised how few times this is used in a lot of water quality monitoring and other ways, but it's not used in a decision-centric way. And when we have wide ranges and diverse challenges, I think it's a key tool to use. In this case, we used it to prioritize a portfolio of projects with clear timelines and when we receive those benefits. And it was also used to estimate the amount of capital. Now, when we got to look at the final inventory of projects, the risk appetite from the leadership team was low, as you might expect. The risk of sudden closure, would like to buy down some of that risk. By looking at that portfolio differently and looking at that risk, I think they were down to like a 98.5% chance of success was the expected success rate, and given the probability. Ultimately, that was going to cost $150 million. And so 50 million bought down that risk to almost 97.5% chance of success. And so by thinking differently and looking at it and being real with some of the constraints, we're able to identify a suite of projects. One of the lessons learned that I'll share was there was challenges in shaping that. Everyone had different ideas, different places, and it really affected their, like, water is the one thread that weaves throughout the mine site. And so it had different influence. They had different preferences. By taking a more structured approach, small group settings, having that dialogue discussions, we were able to take and control for bias so that we didn't have over influence of what someone would like to be. And in some ways, there was better buy-in for the acceptance of those results because ultimately people understood that their idea was heard, it was evaluated in a structured methodology, and that helped that buy-in to move it forward. Translating that to action is challenging. And so there's a bit of telephone of like the scope that I used as a basis of modeling some of those data inputs, which identified them, and the translation of that, and there were challenges. But the client moved ahead through that tipping point and is moving ahead. Back to you, Andrew.
Great. So we're going to move to quite a different case study. So this is a major enterprise software rollout. Multiple sites, multiple languages across the company, many stakeholder groups affected, big organizational change management challenge. We had tried something like this a number of years prior and pretty dismal failure. A lot of anxiety on the part of those affected on the front lines. So it's a pretty high stakes decision. Total cost of the program in hundreds of millions of dollars. These types of programs have a historically high failure rate across the industry, so pretty risky. In the past, when we did this, there wasn't a decision science approach, and in retrospect, I actually did quite a deep dive retrospective on the previous iteration, identified all these decision flaws, unclear governance roles, etc. So we tried kind of the old way and did not go well, and so this was a chance to say, okay, let's start with a really good decision framework and move on from there. The software vendor and site rollout sequence decisions rather were needed early because these were inputs to the service provider request for proposal that was going out. So we wanted people to have assumptions that were going to be representative of what we want to do going forward. So it's kind of critical path. So what we do, hired some experienced decision consultants. We also had some big four management consultants supporting us as SMEs. We had developed an objectives hierarchy for the vendor selection criteria to clearly define what influenced their decision, how they map to each other. And it was interesting, the big four consultants had their own standard criteria for evaluating this, which we found to be far too vague. We couldn't use them, they're just so ambiguous. And my experience with management consultants in general, it's not a huge sample, is that they're quite poor at decision science. There's lots of pretty PowerPoints, but they really don't follow some of the core best practices around clarity. They had estimated that it would take eight weeks to do this decision analysis on vendor selection. We did it in under 2 weeks, a team of 5 people. How did we do this? We used a bookend approach for developing alternatives. So we defined our objectives, and then rather than just saying, okay, I'm going to pick one alternative from here and here, we said, okay, cost is important. Which of these alternatives would be the best on cost, even if it's really bad in other objectives? It's okay, it's this vendor. okay, let's which has the best user experience, best kind of training capacity. Which should that be? Okay, it's this one. Then which would be the most reliable? So we kind of chose alternatives that would just be good at one thing potentially and maybe bad at all the others. That's again a way to stretch the decision space. And then we looked and said it's the same vendor for almost all of these. So the vendor dominated across, and it's software. So there's not a million different alternatives. There's a small subset. So we said, well, let's go fast. And so what we did is then we did a pre-mortem risk analysis to stress test our recommendation. If you haven't done a pre-mortem, this involves imagining you're in the future, looking back at the project, which has failed miserably. And you ask, why has it failed? And you trace that causal chain back to root causes. So it's kind of like a 5 whys technique. You might have seen it safety. And the advantage is that you're not talking about probabilities, oh, it'll never happen. You're just assuming it has, forces you to kind of think through that causal logic. And so what we identified through that pre-mortem is that the likely failure modes were organizational issues. It was people stuff. It was org clarity. It was not software and vendor. So no matter what software we chose, if we didn't figure out the governance and people side of it, everything would fail. And we could probably make multiple software options work if we had that stuff right. So because we did the analysis so fast, we had time to engage broadly with our stakeholders to validate the hypothesis. So I mentioned the previous iteration of this type of program had burned a lot of people. And so we went to a lot of different stakeholders and said, here's our hypothesis. We walked them through our logic and said, we think it's this choice for these reasons. We want you to tell us why we're wrong. Challenge us, help us stress test this really robustly. And so that started building a lot of buy-in. And so when you went to get endorsement for that, it was quite easy because the senior leaders said, oh yeah, my team's consulted, they've told me they're comfortable. So this was something where we could go fast on the analysis, much faster than the management consultants thought we could go. And then we spent more on the engagement because that was really the crux issue. Okay, so that's the vendor selection. Now rollout sequence, how do we do that? We had to get a lot of busy leaders aligned because this is affecting the whole company. We need to have people buy into that. Now, getting a group of senior leaders together to talk about something, you might be a month or two scheduling in a big company. So what we did is we drafted a decision sketch and we said, here's the decision, here's what we think about the range of alternatives that we might consider, here's what we think are the criteria. We kind of roughly put them in rank order, what we think were the most important rather. And then we just went and talked to different key stakeholders internally, one-on-one, let them mark up the decision sketch, about 2 pages. And then as we went through, we got that feedback and people said, oh, this looks good, or you think about this, or I think that ranking of objectives or criteria should be a bit different. And then we realized we have it, we have alignment on this, and we couldn't think about a reason not to kind of carry that, at least as kind of the basis of planning from then. So we wrote up, this all took just a few weeks, wrote up a short decision memo, got it signed off and done. In the past, that might have taken, we would have done a lot of engagement for the decision culture in the company, but it might have taken months. And one of the things that really helped with that is we had implemented a decision accountability framework called RAPID, which was developed by Bain. And essentially it's the decision-making equivalent to RACI or RASCI for work management. So that's, who gets to make the decision, who provides input, who performs the decision, who's a recommender, who's an advisor, who doesn't get to make the decision but has influence. And so because we were clear on that, we said, okay, your role is this. You have an advisory role, that person makes a decision, but you're really important to implementation, so we're talking to you. So that historically had been a big problem, is that we weren't sure exactly who got to make these kind of cross-functional broad decisions. So the combination of RAPID, a clear decision sketch, help us make a big decision quite quickly. And we'll move to the next one.
So Andrew, we're running a little tight on time. I'm wondering maybe skip this one and if I can jump into the final case study, or maybe you want to hit a few points here and then we'll jump into the next one.
I don't see a lot of questions backed up, so let's go through this one.
Okay.
So yeah, and please do queue up those questions. We've got a few slides to go, and we really want to kind of have some discussion. So please do that. So this was case study for doing a project, major scoping study for a major mine expansion, one of the big assets. And we're trying to map out, okay, what are all the criteria we might use in the various trade-off decisions as part of this project? And you can see kind of that hierarchy with things kind of going from big to smaller, more specific to the right, in a little excerpt. And so what we did is we used this for different trade-offs. And what it helped us do is say, okay, we know this is not just an economic question, but we're not sure what else is actually relevant. So this allowed people to think broadly, go through and identify what was important for a particular decision, define it clearly, and then move on. You can see very barely in the image on the right, the yellow. So we hadn't done it yet on this image, but we'd go through and say, is this important for this trade-off decision? Color code it yellow. If it's definitely not important, we'd color code it gray, and blue was kind of, we're not sure yet. So we made sure people thought about all the things that might influence the decision, then quickly narrowed down to what's important. And we had a record of what we didn't include, which is really important. I've often been, a sustainability reviewer on projects, kind of peer reviews. And for some projects where HSEC issues were really critical, permitting, et cetera, the early trade-off studies would have zero reference to permittability, social risk. And I was never sure, did you think about it and decide that they were not relevant, or do you just not think about it at all? And so that's quite ambiguous. So having that explicitly said, we think these are not important for this decision, but they might be for others, was helpful. One area this came in quite handy, having this broad list, was a decision for that same scoping study where we had, do we go into this watershed to the north with our waste rock or not? And we looked at kind of, okay, here, what are the criteria relevant here? Permittability, water management. And that resulted in something where the default decision was the economic value is high here. Let's just assume for this early stage study that waste dump goes into the watershed. When we looked at a very simple MAA, looking at the various social and environmental costs, those quickly added up. And we said, you know what, there's enough on the other side of the ledger. Let's assume that we're not going to the watershed and leave this as an upside to be studied in the next stage. So having that broad lens and then quickly scanning what's important was really instrumental for some of these big project decisions. Back to you, Dan.
Okay, I want to talk about a case study that I feel like is the holy grail of something that I have a lot of passion around, and that's around integrating closure into a life of mine plan. Now, this is a super challenging project. Like in any project, integrating multiple departments. You have the mill production, the metallurgist, and you have the mine operations team, operations and maintenance team. And you've lived an asset that's been around for 20, 30 years. When you look at the mine sites and you look at the diversity of the types of materials that are out there on a site, there's always a diverse inventory of different assets, and some of the mine planning, how they move that asset into the mill and try to identify, if they're going to mill it, and well, what if resource model changes and economics are different, or can we get that recovery right? And so when you end at the end of a mine life, you end up with a whole diverse array of stockpiles of material. You have different waste material types, and so in this case, that was the challenge we were faced, is looking at how we can integrate the final years of mine life, integrate closure into that final years of mine life to reduce some of the risks. We did a 2-day offsite with a series of mine planners, short and long term, some tailings and water specialists and closure teams, and also some key SMEs. And as part of this, we developed an objectives hierarchy, and that's where we identified the diverse objectives that represented the whole life of the asset. And project framing, often you'll look at a specific objective set, but really in an objective setting exercise, you want to look at the broad range of objectives that are important, and that will be useful later as part of the evaluation. We did an inventory of all the dumps and stockpiles, and then we developed each option. And again, there's this drive to evaluate and say, oh, that won't work. And so by separating the identification of options separate from the evaluation, we're able to create a diverse menu of options that you could do with each one of those different stockpiles. And by working in that workshop setting, we're able to control for some of that bias and siloed thinking. One of the challenges is that different departments have different key performance indicators. And so when you're in a production role, you're focused on delivery and recovery. If you're in a closure role, you're looking to reduce that long-term liability. And so by integrating those people and understanding how their differences, we built common understanding and alignment across those priorities and the objectives. By following that detailed and structured options review process, we're able to identify quite quickly, like this happened over a couple days. We did a detailed options review and identify the different options that were available. And we were able to look at and see what were the best options given the multiple objective sets. And so by identifying a diverse array of different objective sets or ways that we could go for the mine, like in this case, there was operational efficiency or what was best for water or what was easiest to do. We had some simple ways to rank and qualitative rank. And ultimately, that led to an alignment of, we started to see some synergies between these objective sets in different directions. And that helped provide a starting point for additional dialogue and planning that ultimately could be integrated into the life of mine plan so that you can start to integrate closure into the life of mine plan. Again, it's the alignment of diverse teams and having those structured dialogue. You're only as good as your best option. And then when you get your best option, you can make it even better by looking at hybrid approaches that integrate more options. It doesn't need to take that much time. So with that, we're going to talk about who's using decision science. Now, there's a diverse range between oil and gas, technology, mixed industrial, BC Hydro, TransLink, and ICBC are some of the ones locally. There's people working in decision education that are working to integrate that into our schools, in conservation, which have high uncertainty on nature and different interactions. In big pharma, it's used quite a bit for research and development portfolios and innovation. Now, all of these companies have high risk, high capital, high uncertainty. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should. In mining, we have all this risk, but the only one that's historically done this is BHP. Now, in oil and gas, you're the odd one out if you don't use this. Now, BHP's work in the energy business brought this to mining, and it's been a core part of their asset growth as their development from a medium-sized player to a global powerhouse. And so we think that decision science and using these tools differently is part of what was a huge source of value. Now, I've heard stories from people at working down in technology at Intel where they've saved $10 billion over 10 years. And not only that, they developed much better ideas. In Chevron, the story was 10 billion in 5 years. The projects are at scale, and at Shell, where there's a very mature decision framework, there's huge savings to do. And we hope that today's presentation encourages you to follow suit with leaders like BHP and others that are leveraging decision science. This is a tool that anyone can learn and do. Andrew, over to you for the healthy decision habits.
Sure. So we'll go through these quickly, but if you want us to unpack them more in the Q&A, just let us know. So we looked at these different frameworks and decision analysis, structured decision making, decision support, decision quality, decision science, different names. There's different tools. Can be a bit kind of complex to think about all these things. What we want to do, this is part of some training we developed, to say, well, what does this look like for behaviors that are scalable? So these are things that apply to choosing where to go for lunch potentially, or like choosing a project configuration for a multi-billion-dollar asset. So we talked a lot about defining the problem. Be really clear that you're solving the right problem at the right time. You want to frame well to move fast. I think we've shared enough stories about that. You make sure you know who decides, what matters in terms of criteria. What's the opportunity space you'll look at, what options you'll consider, which ones you won't. Making your thinking visible. You'll notice that a lot of these are things that are pretty broadly applicable. They're not just relevant to decisions. We rarely write down our assumptions in a clear way. When I was managing studies for Galore Creek project, we had one key assumption that only one person remembered why we had a particular, sedimentation dam in, and he passed away too young a few years later, and that we would have lost that to history, despite there being really good engineers working on that, really good design reports at the PFS level. So making our thinking visible, decision sketches, etc., so that people can help refine our ideas, really valuable. Bringing options, good rule of thumb is never go decision maker without an option. Even Henry Kissinger, when he was Secretary of State in the U.S., going to the president, said, we have three options. We have mutual annihilation, surrender, or my option in the middle. There's always a few options that you can come up with. It might be a do nothing option that is really unattractive, but give them options so that they know you've thought about options, and they might identify some hybrids, as Dan mentioned earlier. So I'll hand it over to Dan to speak to the last 4 habits.
So the next 4 habits, the first one that I'll talk to is break it down. And you'll see as we work through some of those case studies, breaking them down to their individual parts, whether it's characterizing that risk, understanding what they are, and then understanding the dynamics around it. And that framing process helps structure those things so you can individually assess those things and look for how well each of the different actions create what you want. Then you'll see every one of our projects is really getting diverse perspective. It's a huge value driver. The people, whether you're a consultant or owner team, leveraging diversity to fight bias and seeking out and listening carefully, having structured dialogues, meeting people where they're at, going to their desks, sitting with them, getting out on the ground, out in the pit, understanding the problem we're solving and leveraging that diversity is a huge source of value. And it doesn't have to take a long time. It takes some planning and thinking about how you engage different people to meet them wherever they're at. The other huge source of value is embracing uncertainty. A lot of times we take a deterministic mindset because it's mentally easier to handle a specific cost. But the reality is the future is uncertain, and material uncertainties have to be characterized. We cannot ignore them, whether it's an investment, a large capital investment decision, or a small project. By thinking about uncertainty, often we get super focused on precision, and that doesn't help. And then ultimately, if we can measure the decision quality, we can have a better sound check to make sure that the quality of the decision is good, and we can have confidence that we have the highest chance possible on getting the outcome. So back to the beginning. Now we've given you an hour and 10 minutes, or a little bit over here, but there's a few key things. We really want you to see that how you can deliver more value out of your projects. It's just a shift in thinking. It uses the same people with a slightly different process and a structured approach. And it's not just about saving time and money, but it's increasing that upside. Now, hopefully the case studies have demonstrated that. And Andrew's highlighted in some of the habits that those mindsets and skill sets are really important. Those are more important than the tool sets. Again, you can have a carpenter, but it's really the knowledge and skills on how to do this. Now, I'm a paddler, and if you're heading out on Kootenai Lake, local to my town in Nelson, sunny day, you might just grab a canoe, your life jacket, and a couple paddlers. Now, that would be a simple project. Now I've spent time in South America paddling high volume Class 5 rivers in my youth, and when you go to that type of environment or a project like that, you want to have different tools. Now, in this case, I had an advanced kayak, I had training it, and I went with different people. And the reason I give you this case is because as a decision professional, when you lead into complex multidisciplinary projects where there's high stakes, high risk, you want to be able to have the right tools and process. And as a decision professional, we try to offer that decision support, that thought leadership. But ultimately, we work to start small, we look to iterate the problem. We start with framing. Again, remember that acronym, F off, focus on framing and facilitation. Again, these are simple tools, just having structured dialogues and conversations. By doing that, you can unlock a lot of value and upside. So we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. And with that, we'll move to questions.
So I see one question off the bat that I'll jump to, and then feel free, Dan, to jump in as well with your thoughts. So, what are the biggest impediments for implementing these practices with teams or companies that haven't used them before? The change management aspects are pretty significant. Particularly, it's a different way of doing things. Sometimes decision makers can feel threatened if you approach it the wrong way. If you say, "Oh, here's this great," or make a decision saying, "Wait a second, I'm a senior executive. I got here because I make good decisions." And depending on their willingness to learn or not, that can be threatening. So we talk about kind of supporting decision makers who ultimately are the ones who ask for this. I think about the ADKAR model for change that ProSci uses, awareness being the first part. So part of what we're trying to do in this webinar is just raise awareness of some of you have seen these tools, either you haven't or you've seen used in different ways. So just be aware of here's some of the ways they've been used. So you have points of reference for that. This might be helpful here. That desire to use them, when I started, it was just really I identified some problems that we weren't able to solve that were kind of multi-criteria, really complex permitting project issues, and went to my VP and said, I think I've got some tools here we can use, and started from the ground up. Other times the senior executive comes in and says, I want to do this because it worked elsewhere. That's rare in mining. But you kind of have to work with what you got and figure out, is it grassroots, and you find some project directors who find it valuable if you don't have that executive champion. But their lack of awareness, the senior decision makers feel threatened. And then sometimes the jargon can be off-putting. So trying to explain it in common languages, making references to things people already know, risk management, case improvement. There's a lot of overlap in some of the techniques. So I've talked about like, this is like that thing you do in continuous improvement ideation. It's like that thing you do with a risk matrix. So those are a few of the things that I've found work, but certainly the change management aspects have been a huge part of doing this in a large company particularly. Dan?
Yeah, I'll just leave that one. There's another question around for trade-off decisions. How do you handle conflicting goals? Maximize production, minimize costs, or perhaps yeah. So on this one, there's a suite of different tools to, again, mapping those different objectives and looking for objective trade-off mapping and trying to understand where there's a shift or a change. And by looking at those option sets, so when I went through that water volume reduction portfolio, we looked at different objective sets and how well they achieve multiple objectives. And ultimately, we looked for synergies between those objective sets, and then we could look at where there's clear trade-offs and what the benefits were. So often, cost is a fairly easy one to measure, but intangibles can also be measured, and we have structured tools to make judgments on, in this case, there was water volume reduction benefits, but there's other intangibles that are important as you look for consent to operate and other values that you can measure. And so by using a mix of like probabilistic tools and looking differently on how your options perform against these different objectives, you can map those and have, again, more structured dialogue. Further, the other key is to understand decision maker preferences and understanding their priorities and look, okay, if it was all that way, what would that look like? What are the trade-offs associated with that? And so by having, again, that dialogue, that can improve that. Andrew, I think you can add some more to this one too.
Just one point briefly to add is one thing that we ask and try to articulate in the decision sketches, are there really core trade-offs that will define this decision? Sometimes it's not apparent. You kind of have to go through more detailed analysis, but sometimes it's really clear on that software rollout sequencing decision. The core trade-off was, if we can do it at a shorter time, we have fewer costs of, kind of the costs of the support service providers, et cetera, but we have higher risk because we don't have the ability to learn from each sequential implementation. So at the core was a speed and cost savings versus risk of failure. And that was the core trade-off. So if we can get upfront what those are, sometimes that helps get better discussions, focus your analysis. I'll jump to this next question and maybe read it and then throw it to you, Dan. What tools or approaches do you recommend to communicate uncertainty? Does that change for technical audience versus decision makers? You want to have it run?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take that one because it's a challenge. I think thinking probabilistically, while it's a huge source of value, is difficult, and it's not commonly practiced. Often we ask our engineers and scientists to develop a deterministic cost number, and we add plus or minus a range instead of starting early enough. Like when you use tools like expert elicitation, to get a better range early, you can get a sense on where your decision changes. And understanding and working with decision makers to understand when their decision changes and where that tipping point sits and where you're stress testing it, then that ultimately is helpful. But thinking with an uncertainty lens and characterizing that uncertainty, thinking probabilistically, like Andrew and I joke all the time. It's like, well, what's the probability of that? What's the chance? And so you sort of in practice, you work to do that. But I would say it is hard. And I've seen that from day-to-day conversations all the way up to executive conversations. We want certainty, and it's hard to make decisions in the face of risk and uncertainty, especially when that risk isn't fully characterized. So I wouldn't say there's any magic bullet. It takes practice, it takes time, it takes dialogue and discussion, and ultimately familiarity. And some people are more comfortable with it than others. I don't know, Andrew, maybe you can add some points.
Yeah, I'd like just to share a few tactics. And one is if you're showing this to decision makers who are not used to kind of consuming kind of results of probabilistic or range-based modeling, bar charts tend to work better than cumulative distribution functions. So the S curve you might see. So bar, people are more using bar charts. So things like tornado diagrams are usually pretty intuitive. So that's people found a bit easier to digest those. Another tactic, and this is what anyone can apply, is, and I've had to coach myself, train myself to do this, is, when I'm talking about uncertainty in writing a memo or something, I will try to avoid just linguistic descriptors like very uncertain, highly uncertain. I will try to put in brackets less than 5%, less than 10%. People don't want to do that because it kind of sticks your neck out. But it's really clear that the research around how people interpret probable or improbable or highly probable, there's huge swings. Like different people have very different interpretations. So if you say something's unlikely or likely in a memo, it could mean something very different than you intend. So just putting in brackets, I mean less than 5%, I mean 5 to 10%. And people can, it's a source of question or debate, right? And that's one thing that I would do when I was kind of a senior advisor on permitting things. I would throw numbers out that said, I think this issue, if not dealt with, is a 12, 24-month delay, as opposed to this might be hard. And then it gives the decision maker something to grapple with. Do I care about that? Well, I probably do. And then if they want to start debating, is it 12 to 24? Is it 6 to 36 months? Then you're actually having a useful conversation, right, about like how much do we care about uncertainty? So sticking your neck out, throwing numbers out there in ranges if you want, gets way better conversations, but you have to be a little bit brave because most people default to the ambiguity of just saying it's highly likely or unlikely.
Maybe I'll answer one question and then I'll throw the next question to you. So the question that I'll answer is, what's your favorite software tools for use in decision science? And so often the tools are actually quite simple, like, right? So not software, but the tools that I use are often just 4x6 index cards and to facilitate just like any other facilitator. And then for software, often just a simple Excel table, or we've done virtual settings, we'll use a whiteboard. So that software tools are useful. But on modeling uncertainty, there's a couple key programs that run those stochastic models that run your Monte Carlo simulation that are fairly user intuitive. Oracle's Crystal Ball is one that I've been working with. I purchased that. Anyway, you can get a copy of that for around $1,500 US. And then there's also At Risk that came from Palisade. I think there's a slightly different name that also uses valuable tools. But really, it's about modeling Monte Carlo in a user-friendly way and tying that to decisions. So if you can characterize risk and uncertainty better using those types of software. So Andrew, the question to you.
Oh, go ahead. I'll add just one thing there. So on the probabilistic modeling side, there is a free, it's called SIP Math, SIP Math, probabilitymanagement.org, which is trying to kind of introduce this as a comment. So that's something if you want to play around without spending the money. You can also do a bunch of stuff in Excel alone if you're a sophisticated Excel user. So those are kind of the quant tools. On the qualitative tools, I mentioned virtual facilitation. So I used to do that with Excel sheets shared on a SharePoint site. That works. It's pretty boring to interface with. Other tools that can be quite helpful are Miro and Mural, kind of virtual whiteboard tools, quite powerful. They're not great for kind of control. They're really good for ideation, moving quickly, sketching things out. So those have been a big enabler for virtual workshops, although some companies may have controls against using it for security reasons, but for virtual facilitation, those can be quite useful tools, and they're much better than the virtual whiteboard that Microsoft has, which doesn't really have a lot of functionality. Back to you, Dan.
Okay, the next question is a really good one. I think this is at the heart of what's challenging and why sometimes having an external facilitator is useful. So can you speak to an approach or strategy for managing individual bias? And the person shared their experience around bias, strong personalities, push from the larger group down a narrower path, and looking for ways to keep the whole group thinking big and creatively. And so I'll pass it to you, Andrew, and then maybe I'll add some details when you're done.
Sure. This can be particularly pernicious when you have what we call the hippo effect, highest paid person's opinion. So everyone's kind of looking around at when is that person going to speak, and so there's lots of different facilitation techniques to do this. I mean, if you know the person well, you can sometimes have a conversation ahead of time, like, hey, we want to create space for other people to hear and speak. Those people don't always respond to that, so maybe that doesn't work. There's when we facilitate, we'll use a lot of things to make sure introverts are getting their ideas surfaced. And so part of that is doing quiet work. So when we do ideation, whether it's in person or virtually, we'll say, okay, everyone, we've worked through the scoping, problem definition, vision, success discussion. Now we're on to the idea generation, issue generation. And we say, hey, everyone, we're going to give you 5 minutes, 10 minutes to write ideas down on a sticky note, whether it's virtual or in person. And then we're going to put those, and they can be anonymous. And then we kind of, put them all on the board. And so by not making it a one mic or soapbox means everyone gets a bunch of ideas on the table, and it's not just you kind of wait for, when you share in an unstructured environment, the confident extroverts will speak up, the less experienced introverts, as a stereotype, will speak less, and they might have the right idea, right? They might have, so yeah, there's lots of different facilitation techniques. Those are some of the ones we use, but definitely that issue generation of getting all of people's ideas and worries on the table initially helps kind of get a diverser perspective that can help then identify if that one person is off an island by themselves with really strong views. And we also found that them getting it in writing on the board makes them a bit less inclined to get up and get on the soapbox and talk. So anyway, those are a few techniques. Dan, I'm sure you can think of some more.
Yeah, a couple other ones that I like to use, or a way, because often when you run a multi-session workshop and you allow for asynchronous work, you can connect with those people one-on-one, and often the ideas and the understanding is much improved through those sessions and through that dialogue, the discussion with decision makers, with their team. They'll get new, better ideas. And so having those sessions and creating space for that water cooler chat, and then also that can create a huge sort of, like, that's a way to sort of understand that. And also, like, Andrew and I have been in the business in mining sector for 20 plus years for myself, 25 for Andrew. And so having subject matter expertise and understanding the differences and some of the tensions, that can also be helpful, because we don't just, we're seeking to understand them. Another tool is doing structured interviews afterwards and just simply being available. That's like, if they have a different ideas, and so you're really, you're working as a thought partnership with these clients to really resolve and work through that process. And so again, you're always looking for shortcuts, but you fight bias through processes and ultimately by working with a diverse crowd in different ways. You got any other?
Yeah, another question from Jennifer. After the idea generation workshop, sorting through the ideas, sometimes hundreds, can be a challenge. What strategies for improving efficiency for this aspect can you suggest? I mean, first, if you're getting hundreds of ideas, that's amazing, because sometimes groups need a bit of encouraging to get going. I mean, in person, which has a lot of advantages, but if that's writing on sticky notes, typically, I mean, there's a bit of grunt work there. Virtually, you can sort things more quickly by keyword searches, by affinity. One of the things that we've found works well in a virtual environment is, typically the process step is we do the idea and issue generation. It's just anything you think of, put on a sticky note, just yes and don't evaluate. And this is in the front end of that diamond. You don't evaluate, you don't critique. And then when you get to the sorting, is it a decision, is it a value or objective, that next step, we actually crowdsource. We say to the group, you put it where you think it is and we'll validate it as a group. So sometimes you can get the whole group involved and like pick up the sticky note, put it in which bucket you think it goes in, and then you do it. So we don't do the, okay, everyone, here's a sticky note, where's it go? 20 people, give you an opinion. We tend to do a rough one with everyone involved and then kind of validate. And then we, as experienced people, like, oh, that looks like it might actually fit here, but that is a way to get, it's all a lot more fun for people to be all hands on deck.
We also have specific tools that are meant to handle high volumes of decisions and sort them in different ways. There's a decision hierarchy where we're sorting facts, objectives, uncertainties from decisions, actions you can take, and then we can further sort that into different ways. So we have good structured process to handle higher volumes of it, and it can be very scaled and useful. But thanks everyone for your questions. I think we'll turn it over to Karen now to close out our webinar. Again, if you have questions or you're interested in the workshop that we're going to present at CIM, please ask a question or share it on LinkedIn. We love decision science. We want to promote this practice in mining, and we hope that you've taken away some value. Any final words there, Andrew?
Just also to add, if you like to do a bit of self-directed study learning, we can recommend a lot of books ranging from the beginner to kind of highly quantitative. So if you want to learn more, we've got lots of recommendations we could provide.
Excellent. Thank you both. You know, as always, you bring such a lot of tools and techniques and share all your lessons over the years and some unique case studies to like really showcase, you know, where this comes to light and how that can be resolved. So, you know, thank you for your time on sharing all of this with everyone. And I posted in the chat, hopefully everyone could see those links, that there is going to be a workshop at CIM. It will be on the Saturday prior to the CIM conference. So watch for that registration link if you want to learn and try to dive into using some of these tools. They're going to demonstrate some things and have everybody trying some things out. And we do have those upcoming webinars, so watch for those as well. We'll be sharing those on LinkedIn and CIM as well. If you're on their newsletter, you will be able to see those there. I guess the last thing is just like, I love hearing about, you know, especially with getting everyone involved in some of the techniques you use with the quiet time and the sticky notes on the wall. And I've done that myself as well. And I just want to add like one other key thing that comes out of that is I find a lot of times people will see that they have the same issues or the same ideas as anybody else, and at first they were not sure if they should say something about that, but then once they can see that they have common thinking, then it gets that discussion going as well, because it's out there. So yeah, it just helps move people to conversation, like you said. So yeah, again, sure. Thank you so much, and hopefully everyone enjoyed this session. We'll share the link, the recording afterwards as well. So if you want to share it further, please do. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks,
bye, everyone.